The seat is A1 first row, house left, closest to the piano. I have paid for that seat and left it empty at every performance I have given for 20 years. And last night, for the first time, someone was sitting in it. I saw it from the wings. That is my ritual. Before every concert, I find a gap in the curtain, and I look at A1, empty, and I say the same 3 words in my head, and then I walk out. 20 years, hundreds of halls. Vienna, Chicago, a converted church in Maine that held 90 people. Always the same empty seat, always the same 3 words. And last night, at the Kimmel Center in Philadelphia, 40 minutes from the elementary school where all of this started, I looked through the gap and there was a man in it. An old man. Very old. I could see that even from the wings, in the half-dark, the particular stillness that very old men have. Suit that didn't fit him anymore. The way suits stop fitting when you have started to leave your body a little. Hands folded on a program in his lap. My first feeling was not what you would expect. It was not curiosity. It was rage, a hot, absurd, immediate rage that someone had taken the seat, that the house manager had made a mistake, that a stranger was sitting in the place I had kept clean for 2 decades. I actually turned to find someone to tell. That is how strong it was. And then he lifted his head and looked toward the stage, at nothing, at the empty piano, and the light from the stage caught his face. And I made a sound, out loud in the wings, 4 minutes before curtain. My accompanist told me afterward that he thought I was ill. I want to tell you who was in that seat. I will. Every word of what happened after. I promise. But if I tell you now, it will just be a nice ending. And it is not a nice ending. It is 33 years long, and the last 20 of those years contain something I did not learn until the lobby had emptied out and the ushers were stacking chairs. Something that changed the shape of my entire adult life in about 9 seconds. So let me take you back to when I was 9 years old and stop talking. Welcome back to Still Standing Stories, where the women who were saved by someone quiet finally get to find out what it cost them. If someone once got you through the worst thing that ever happened to you, and you never got to say thank you, and you have carried that debt for years, this story is for you. Subscribe before we go on, because what that man had been doing for 20 years while I kept his seat empty is the part I still cannot say out loud without stopping, and I want you to know everything about him before you hear it. My name is Elena Marchetti. I'm 42 years old. I am a mezzo-soprano, which means I sing opera for a living, which means that I make my living entirely out of my voice, and I want you to hold that fact against this one. Between the ages of 9 and 12, I did not speak a single word to another human being. Not one. Not to my mother. Not to a doctor. Not once, for 3 years. My father died when I was 9. He was a contractor, 41 years old, and he fell from a roof on a Tuesday morning in October in Delaware County. And he was gone before the ambulance reached the hospital. I was in the 3rd grade. They came and got me out of class, and my aunt drove me home, and my mother was on the kitchen floor with her back against the dishwasher, and that is where my childhood divides. Cleanly, the way a log splits, there is the part before I walked into that kitchen and the part after. I do not remember making a decision to stop speaking. That is the thing people get wrong about it. Nobody says, "I will now be silent." I remember that words started to feel enormous and dangerous, like something you should not handle without training, and I remember that every time I opened my mouth in the weeks after the funeral there was a kind of static where the sentence should have been. And I remember that, after a while, a few weeks, maybe 2 months, the static was just how it was, and the silence had closed over me like water over a stone. And by then it was not a choice anymore. It was a condition, it had me. The clinical term, I learned much later, is selective mutism, though mine was severe and total, which is rarer. Some of it is anxiety, some of it is grief that has nowhere to go, and so it goes into the throat. The doctors at the time had a range of theories and a range of interventions, and I want to be fair to them. They tried. Everyone tried. That is what I most want you to understand about those 3 years. I was not neglected. I was surrounded by adults who were doing everything they could think of. They just were all doing the same thing. My mother, who was drowning herself. Remember, 29 years old with a dead husband and a silent child, took me to a pediatrician, who took me to a child psychologist, who took me to a speech therapist, who referred me to a psychiatrist in Philadelphia, who saw me twice a month for a year. There were 4 different professionals, and my mother and my grandmother and my teachers, and every single one of them, without exception, wanted the same thing from me and made it very clear. They wanted me to talk. I understand it. God, as an adult I understand it. A 9-year-old goes silent, and every adult who loves her feels the same panic. And the panic says, get her talking, get her back, make her say something. But I want to describe what that is like from the inside, because I think a lot of you have been on one side or the other of this. Every room I entered for 3 years was a room with a demand in it. Nobody phrased it as a demand, they phrased it as love. Elena, can you tell me how you're feeling today? Elena, honey, just try. Just one word for mommy. We're going to try something new today, Elena. I bet you can do this one. The speech therapist had a sticker chart. The psychologist had a puppet. My grandmother, once in frustration, said in front of me that I was doing it on purpose and I could stop whenever I wanted, and my mother screamed at her, and I sat on the couch between them and could not defend myself, because defending myself would have required the one thing I could not do. Everyone in my life wanted something from me that I was physically unable to give, and every interaction was a small failure, and I failed all day, every day, for 3 years. I was 9, then 10, then 11, and every adult in my world was, with total love and total sincerity, waiting for me to become someone else. Do you understand how tired a child gets? I was tired in a way that I have not been tired since, and I have sung Verdi. I want to tell you what those 3 years were actually like, because I gave you the shape of them and not the weight, and the weight is the reason any of this matters. The thing nobody prepares you for is that the silence has stages. In the first months it is a wound and everyone treats it as one. Gently, with alarm. By the end of the first year it has become a fact about you, and the alarm has cooled into something worse, which is management. And by the second year, when you are 10, it becomes an identity that other people have assigned to you and that you can feel hardening around you like plaster. I was the girl who doesn't talk. That is who I was in that building. Teachers introduced me that way to substitutes, quietly in the doorway, thinking I could not hear. The dark-haired one, she doesn't speak, don't call on her. Kids at first were curious, then bored, then cruel in the ordinary casual way of children. There was a stretch in 5th grade when a group of boys made a game of trying to startle a sound out of me, jumping out from behind the lockers. And I want to be fair, they were 11, they had no idea what they were doing. It stopped when it stopped being interesting. But the loneliness of it was total in a way I have never been able to describe to anyone who hasn't lived it, because I could hear everything. That is what people forget. My hearing was fine, my understanding was fine, my inner life was extremely loud. I had opinions about everything. I had jokes I would have made. There was a full person in there running at normal speed and no exit anywhere. And I could not comfort my mother. That is the part that still gets me, and it took me until my 30s in a therapist's office to say it out loud. My mother was 29 and widowed, and she would sit on the edge of my bed at night and cry, and I would put my hand on her arm, and that was everything I had. She needed to hear that I was all right. She needed it desperately, and I was the only person on earth who could give it to her, and I could not, for 3 years. There were nights she'd say, "Just tell me you're okay. Elena, please. Just tell me you're okay." And I would lie there with my hand on her arm and the static roaring and nothing would come, and she would eventually stop asking and just cry, and I would lie in the dark afterward hating myself with a completeness that a child should never be capable of. So when I say that every room had a demand in it, I want you to understand that the demand was not unreasonable. My mother was not a villain. She was a drowning woman asking her daughter for a life raft. Everyone who pulled at me was pulling because they loved me, and they were frightened. That is what makes it so hard to talk about. There was no bad guy. There was a 9-year-old inside a wall, and a ring of good people outside it, all pushing on the wall as hard as they could out of love, and every push made the wall thicker. And not one of them could have known that, which is why what Arthur Bell did was not just kind, it was a diagnosis. He was the only adult in my life who correctly identified that the wall was load-bearing, that it was holding something up, and that the way out was not to push on it but to sit down next to it and wait. I have had 20 years to think about where he got that. He never said, but he was a man in his 50s who had never married, who had spent 31 years in a job with no advancement in a district that did not care about music, who had a way of stopping mid-sentence and looking out the window. I suspect, I have no evidence, and I will never ask him now, that at some point Arthur Bell had been inside his own wall, and that somebody, or nobody, had sat down next to it. And then in 5th grade, I met Mr. Bell. Arthur Bell was the music teacher at my elementary school. He was, I would guess, in his mid-50s then, thin, tall, stooped a little, the posture of a man who had spent his life leaning over a keyboard. He wore cardigans. He had very white hair and the kind of face that looks stern in repose and completely rearranges when it smiles. He had been at that school for something like 25 years and would be there for a few more, and he was, as far as anybody knew, entirely ordinary. A school music teacher in a district that did not care much about music. He ran the recorder unit and the winter concert and the 4th grade XY Luffones. I was assigned to his class the way everyone was. Music twice a week, half an hour, and in a class of 26 children where you are required to sing, a child who does not speak is a problem to be managed. Every teacher I had managed it differently. Some had me mouth the words. Some excused me to the library. One had me hand out papers so I would have a job that was not talking. Mr. Bell, in that first class, did none of those things. He took attendance and got to my name, and I raised my hand instead of saying here, which is what I did, and he made a mark and said, Elena, not a question, just my name, acknowledged, and moved on. And that was it. That was the whole accommodation. He said my name and did not need anything back. I want to be honest, I did not notice this at the time. It registers now, in memory, as the first door. The real thing happened about 6 weeks into that year. It was a Thursday afternoon in late October. I know it was October because it was the anniversary month. And October was always bad. October is still bad, and I had had a very bad day for reasons I no longer remember. And instead of going to the bus, I went into the music room, which was empty, and I sat down in the corner behind the equipment cart where you could not be seen from the door. I do not know what I intended. I think I intended to be somewhere no one would find me and require anything of me. That was most of what I wanted those years. Mr. Bell came in maybe 10 minutes later. I heard him. I did not move. He put something down on his desk, and he saw me. I know he saw me. The equipment cart hid me from the door, but not from the desk, and I braced myself for it. For the kind voice, for Elena, is everything all right? Do you want to talk about it? For the demand, arriving as it always did, wearing the face of kindness. And he did not say one word to me. He sat down at the piano, with his back to my corner, and he played. He played for about 40 minutes, I do not know what it was. Something slow, then something faster, then something slow again. He never turned around, he never spoke. And at some point in the second piece I stopped bracing, because I understood, with the whole body, the way children understand things before they have language for them, that nothing was going to be asked of me. That I could sit in that corner as long as I wanted, and this man was simply going to play the piano. And my silence was not a problem he was trying to solve, and there was nothing I had to do. I had not been in a room like that in 2 years. At about 4:30 he stopped and closed the lid and said, still not looking at my corner, I'm here every day until 5. And he picked up his bag and left me alone in the music room with the door open. I came back the next day, and the day after that, and then, more or less, every school day for the next 3 years. I want to give you more of the music room, because I have compressed 3 years into a few paragraphs, and it was the most important room I have ever been in, including every opera house on this earth. The rules of that room were never stated, and I understood all of them within a week. You could come in any day. You did not have to come in. Nobody checked. And if you missed 4 days, nothing was said when you came back on the 5th. No, we missed you. No, where have you been? which sounds cold and was in fact the single most generous policy possible, because it meant that coming in was never a commitment and leaving was never a betrayal. I tested this. There was a stretch in the winter of the second year when I stopped going for almost 3 weeks, for reasons I don't remember, probably nothing. When I came back, he was at the piano and the metronome was on the floor by my corner, ticking, exactly as if I had been there the day before. He had put it out every one of those days. I have thought about that more than almost anything else in my life. He wound and set a brass metronome in an empty corner of an empty room for 3 weeks for a child who was not coming. You did not have to sit anywhere in particular. Over 3 years I migrated corner, then the chair by the window, then the risers, then, eventually, standing at the piano. He never remarked on any of it. The one time he did anything at all was the week I moved to the risers, when he stopped playing, got up, moved a music stand that was blocking the sightline, and sat back down. 20 seconds, no comment. You did not have to like it. There were days I came in angry, furious, the way an 11-year-old whose father fell off a roof is periodically furious, and I would sit in the corner and radiate, and he would play something loud. Not gentle loud. Prokofiev, I found out years later, when I finally identified one of them from memory in a practice room at Curtis and had to go sit down in the hallway. He matched me. He never once played something soothing at a child who was angry, which is what every other adult in my life did, and which never works because it tells you that your anger is the problem. And there was a thing he did that I have never seen another human being do. When something bad had happened, and there were things, a bad anniversary, a bad day at school, my mother having a hard week, he could tell. I do not know how. And on those days he would not play something sad and he would not play something happy. He would play something long. He would pick a piece that took 25 minutes and he would play the whole thing, without stopping, so that the room simply continued for a very long time. That is all. He just made the room last longer on the bad days. I did not understand it then. I understand it now, and it is this. When you're in that much pain, you do not need to be cheered up, and you do not need to be met in your sadness. You need proof that time is still passing and that the world will still be here on the other side of the next 25 minutes. He gave me the next 25 minutes over and over, on the worst days of my childhood, in the form of a long piece of music played by a man with his back to me. The last rule, and the one that took me longest to see, nothing that happened in that room was ever mentioned outside of it. Not once in 3 years. I would pass him in the hallway and he would nod the way he nodded at every child. In music class twice a week he treated me precisely as he treated the other 25 kids, marked me present, moved on, no special glance, no significant look. Nothing. If a teacher had asked him about me, I am certain he would have said something bland and true. He kept my secret from every adult in my life for 3 years, including the ones trying to help me. And he was right too. Stay with me, because I need to tell you what he actually did, and how careful it was, because it took me 20 years and a conversation in an empty concert hall to understand that none of it was accidental. The metronome came on about the 4th day. It was a brass Seth Thomas, the old pyramid kind with the wooden case, and it had lived on top of his piano since before I was born. On the 4th or 5th day I came in, and it was not on the piano. It was on the floor in my corner, next to where I sat, already going. Talk, 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 he never mentioned it. He was at the piano when I came in, and it was already ticking, and he played, and at 5 he stopped and picked it up and put it back on the piano, and the next day it was on the floor by my corner again. Ticking. I want to tell you what a metronome does to a child in that condition, because I did not have the words for it then and I have spent my adult life finding them. When you cannot speak, time stops working properly. There is no rhythm to anything. Days are undifferentiated. You are inside a silence that has no edges, and it feels permanent, because nothing marks its passing. And into that a man put a small brass machine that did nothing but divide time into pieces. Talk, talk, talk. Something in the room was moving forward at a steady rate, reliably, without needing anything from me. He gave me a heartbeat that was not my own to keep going. Years later, Decades later, last night, in fact, I found out what he said to himself about it. But at the time, I only knew that I wanted it there, and that when it wound down, I would look at it, and that on about the 10th day, he stopped, mid-piece, and got up and wound it without a word and sat back down and kept playing from where he'd stopped. Which meant he was watching. Which meant that a man who never turned around was tracking a machine on the floor behind him, and knew when it needed him. That was the year I was 10. The second year, he started teaching me, without ever saying he was teaching me, and without ever asking me to do a single thing. He would play something, then he would say, "To the room, to the piano," never turning around. That's a fifth. It sounds hollow. Composers use it when they want the floor to fall out. And then he'd play it again. Or this next one is in a minor key, which people think means sad. It doesn't mean sad, it means unresolved. There's a difference, and most people never learn it. There's a difference, and most people never learn it. He said that to a 10-year-old who could not speak, over his shoulder, and did not wait for a response and went back to playing. 3 or 4 times a week, for 2 more years, I received a private music education from a man who never once looked at me while giving it and never once checked whether I was listening. He gave it into the air of that room and let me pick it up or not. And in the 3rd year, he started leaving the bench. This was so small that I did not register it as a strategy for 20 years. He would play until about 4:30, and then he would say, "I need to go check my mailbox," or "I'm gonna get some water," and he would get up and leave the room, leaving the piano open and the room empty, and me in the corner. He was gone 8 or 10 minutes, and then he'd come back and play until 5. He did this every single day for months before I touched it. The first time, I put one finger on one key. That was all. I have never been more frightened, and I took my finger off and sat back down in the corner, and when he came back he sat down at the piano and played, and did not say anything, and I could not tell if he knew. He knew, of course. He had left the room specifically so that I could do it in private. He built me 8 minutes a day of a world with no witnesses in it, which is the only condition under which a person like me could try anything at all. I was at that piano every day within 2 weeks. I taught myself badly in 8-minute increments, and he came back every day and played and said nothing about it, except that his little over-the-shoulder lessons started drifting toward things I would have been fumbling with the day before. The left hand is just the floor. Don't fuss over the left hand is where you stand. He was correcting me without ever acknowledging that I was playing. And then, one afternoon in the spring, when I was 12 years and 4 months old, he was playing something I had heard many times, a Schubert song, I know now, Du bist die Ruhe, and I was standing beside the piano, which is where I stood by then, and my mouth opened and a sound came out. Not a word. I want to be very precise here because this is the center of my life. It was not a word, it was a note. I sang the vocal line, one phrase of it, in a voice that had not made a sound in 3 years and cracked and was barely audible and was unmistakably on pitch. He did not stop playing, he did not turn, he did not gasp or cry or grab me, and I have thought about this every day of my adult life, because I know exactly what would have happened if he had. If he had spun around on that bench with tears in his eyes and said, "Elena, you sang," the door would have slammed shut, and it would have taken me another 5 years, or forever. The moment a thing like that is seen and named, a child like me can never do it again. He kept playing. He played the accompaniment through, to the end of the phrase, and then he went back and played the phrase again. He gave me the phrase back, so I could do it a second time. I did. And he played it again. And I sang it again. And that is how it happened. Not a breakthrough, not a scene, just a man refusing to make an event out of a miracle. 12 or 15 times through the same 8 bars in an empty music room on a Thursday in April, until the light went orange, and it was 5 o'clock, and he closed the lid and said exactly as he had said every day for 3 years, "I'm here every day until 5. That is all he ever said about it. Ever. I spoke to my mother 11 days later. I want to be clear that the singing came first, that I could sing for 11 days before I could say one word to my own mother, which tells you something about what music actually is that I have spent my life trying to explain to funders. The first thing I said to her was, "The milk's gone." Those are the words. 3 years of silence, and the first thing out of me was that the milk had gone off in the kitchen on a Saturday. And my mother put down what she was holding and did not turn around either, and I understand now that she had been coached by the psychologist for exactly that moment, and I'm so grateful to that psychologist. I could weep, she said. I'll get more today. And that was it. And she went into the bathroom and ran the water so I would not hear her. And I stood in the kitchen, and my whole life started again. I told Mr. Bell on Monday. I walked into the music room and I said, I talked to my mom. And he turned around on the bench, the only time I can remember him doing it. And he looked at me and he said, Good, that's the harder one. And then he turned back and played. That's the harder one, he knew. He knew that speaking to your mother, in the wreckage of a house where a man had died, was a far more difficult act than singing to a stranger. And he did not congratulate me. He assessed the achievement accurately, which is a form of respect I have almost never received since. I was in that music room until the end of 8th grade. Then I went to the high school, and he stayed at the elementary, and I saw him maybe 4 times in the next 2 years, at a district concert, once in a parking lot. And when I was 15, he retired. I did not go to whatever they did for him. I want to be honest about this because it is the thing I have had to make peace with. I was 15. I had just gotten into a summer program. I had a life that had started very late and was going very fast. And I was not thinking about the music room, and nobody told me it was happening, and by the time I heard about it, it had happened. He left after 31 years, and I did not send a card, and then I got busy for 25 years. I studied at Curtis, I sang in Europe for 11 years. I came back. I built a career that is, by any measure, more than I had any right to expect from a kid in Delaware County who did not speak. And underneath all of it, from about my mid-20s onward, ran a single low current of guilt that never once went quiet. I had tried to find him. I want that on the record, because I know how this sounds. I tried 3 times over the years. But Arthur Bell is a very common name, and he was old enough that he was not on anything, and the school district's records office told me twice that they could not give out information about retired employees. In 2011, I found an obituary for an Arthur Bell in Bucks County, right age, and I sat on the floor of a hotel room in Munich and cried for an hour before I found the man's photograph, and it was not him. After that, I stopped looking. Not because I gave up, because I could not do that again. I should tell you about the 25 years in between, because I have skipped them, and they are the reason the seat exists at all. The voice came in fast once it came. That happens sometimes with kids like me. The thing that was dammed up arrives all at once. By 15, I was in a summer program at Westminster. At 17, I auditioned for Curtis and got in, which does not happen to people from my high school, and my mother cried in the car for 11 minutes without saying anything, which was her version of a brass band. And I was, for about a decade, insufferable. I want to be honest about that. There is a specific kind of arrogance available to a person who was silent as a child and then discovers that her voice is unusual, and I had all of it. I was difficult with conductors. I was competitive in a way I'm not proud of. I dropped a friend in my 20s, a good one, essentially because she got a role I wanted, and I never fixed it, and now she has a whole life somewhere, and I'm not in it. I bring this up because I do not want to give you the version where the traumatized child becomes a saintly artist. I became a good singer and a fairly hard person, and the hardness came from the same place as the voice, from 3 years of learning that you survive by not needing anything from anybody. Mr. Bell gave me a room with no demands in it. And that saved my life. And it also taught me that the safest thing in the world is a room where nobody needs anything from you. And I built an adult life full of those, and they are lonely. I did not marry either. I have had 2 long relationships, both good men, both of whom said some version of the same thing on the way out, that there was a room in me they were never going to be allowed into. They were right. The room has a piano in it and a metronome on the floor, and I have never been able to let anybody else in there, and I do not entirely know why. My mother died when I was 34. Pancreatic, 11 months from diagnosis. I was on a plane back from Munich every 3 weeks that year, and my voice was in the worst shape of my professional life, and no one in Europe knew why. At the end, she said something to me that I did not understand for 8 years. She said, "I always knew you'd come back. Somebody in that school gave you back to me and I never found out who it was." I said, "It was the music teacher, Mom." And she said, "I know it was the music room. I never knew what he did in there." I could not tell her, because I did not have language for it yet, and because it would have taken 4 hours, and because she was very tired. She died about a week later. And that unfinished sentence, "I never found out who it was," is a large part of why the empty seat became what it became. 6 years after that, in Boston, there were 2 deaths by then. His and hers. The searching I told you about was mostly in those years. 3 real attempts plus the obituary in 2011 that turned out to be a different Arthur Bell. What I did not tell you is what that afternoon in Munich actually was, because it matters to what happened in the lobby. I found the obituary at about 2 in the afternoon in a hotel on Turkhanstrasse. Arthur Bell, correct age range, Bucks County, survived by no one listed. And I sat down on the floor between the bed and the window, and I did not cry the way you cry when someone dies. I cried the way you cry when a door closes. Because the thing I had been carrying, the thank you, the whole enormous, unpayable thing had, in that moment, become permanent. Not unpaid, unpayable forever. And the difference between those two is the difference between a debt and a wound. I found the photograph about an hour later on a funeral home's website. Round-faced man with glasses. A Rotary Club sort of face. Not him. Nothing like him. And I want to tell you the honest thing about that hour, which I have never said to anyone. When I saw the photograph and knew it was not him, my first feeling was not relief. It was something closer to dread, because it meant the search was open again, and the debt was live again, and I would have to keep carrying it, and I had just spent an hour finding out what it felt like to put it down. That is what an unpaid debt to someone who saved you does over decades. It stops being purely gratitude. It becomes something you would occasionally, in a hotel room in another country, be relieved to be free of. And then you hate yourself for that too. After Munich, I stopped looking, and 2 years later I started buying the seat. And that is when the seat started. It began in a small hall in Boston, 20 years ago, at a recital I had thought about canceling because my mother had just been diagnosed with the thing that eventually took her. I was in the wings and I was falling apart. And I did the thing you do, which is reach for anything solid, and what I reached for was a brass metronome on the floor of a music room. Talk, talk, talk. Something is moving forward at a steady rate and does not need anything from you. And I thought, with the total clarity that comes about 4 minutes before you have to walk on stage, I never thanked him. I went to the box office at intermission, and I bought seat A1 for the second half. It was already sold. They moved the person, comped them, whatever. I paid for both, and I sang the second half of that recital to an empty chair in the first row. I did it again at the next concert, and the one after, and it became the thing I do. For 20 years I have paid for A1 and left it empty. Every hall? It is in my rider, which I know is the sort of thing that gets you a reputation. And it did. There are 2 profiles of me that mention it and get it wrong. One says it is for a dead lover. My manager fought me about it for years, then gave up, then started handling it himself. It has cost me, over 2 decades, a genuinely stupid amount of money. And before every performance I look through the gap in the curtain at that empty seat and I say 3 words in my head. The 3 words are, I'm still here. Not thank you. I tried thank you for the first year and it was wrong, because thank you is something you say to someone who is present, and the whole point was that he was not, and never would be. I'm still here was accurate. It was a report filed to an empty chair by a woman who had been given a voice by a man who never asked for anything back. I'm still here. It worked. It let me carry the debt in a way that did not crush me. 20 years, hundreds of times, into an empty chair. And last night the chair was not empty. I want to walk you through it exactly, because I have gone over it perhaps 40 times since, and every detail has become important to me. 4 minutes to curtain, the gap in the curtain. The old man in the too large suit, hands folded on his program. The rage, then his face turning up into the light, then the sound I made in the wings. It was him. He was 88 years old. He had a full head of white hair still, and he had folded his hands the way he folded them on the piano lid at 5 o'clock. And I would have known him at any age, in any light, in any city on earth. My accompanist Yuri took my arm and said something. I could not hear him. I remember saying, "That's my teacher." And Yuri saying, "What?" And me saying, "That's my teacher. That's my music teacher. He's in the seat." And Yuri looking at me with real alarm because we were now 2 minutes out and his soloist was coming apart. And then I did the only professional thing I have ever been proud of. I said out loud to nobody, "He came to hear a singer." And I walked out and I sang. I'm not going to pretend to you that I sang well. There is a recording. The house records everything. I have not listened to it and I'm not going to. I know that I got through the first piece on technique alone, which is what technique is for. And I know that somewhere in the second, Brahms, the Zigeuner leader, I stopped performing at a hall and started singing at one seat in the first row. The way I had once sung standing at a piano to a man who would not turn around. He did not cry, by the way. I could see him the entire concert. He sat with his hands folded and his chin slightly lifted, and he listened the way he had always listened. And once in the middle of the Schubert set, I put Du bist die Ruhe in the program 11 years ago, and it has never come out. Once, during that, he closed his eyes. 88 years old, in a suit that no longer fit, listening to a mezzo-soprano at the Kimmel Center, singing the song that had been the first sound she ever made. I got through it. There was an encore. There was applause. And then there was the part where the house lights come up and you have to become a person again. And I went out to the lobby faster than I've ever moved in evening clothes, and I found him at the edge of the crowd, standing very carefully with one hand on a chair back. I want to tell you what I said, because I have imagined it for 20 years and prepared entire speeches, and what actually came out was, "You're alive." And Arthur Bell, 88 years old, looked at me and said, "So far?" And then I broke down completely in the lobby of the Kimmel Center in front of maybe 200 people. And my former music teacher patted my shoulder twice, awkwardly, the way a man of that generation does, and said, all right, let's sit down before one of us falls down." We sat in the emptying hall for 2 hours. The ushers stacked chairs around us. At one point, the house manager came to say something about closing, and Yuri intercepted him, and I do not know what he said, but nobody bothered us again. And in the first 10 minutes, he told me the thing that broke my life open. I had asked him, obviously it was the first real question, how he came to be there. Whether someone had told him? Whether he had seen a poster? I had this whole picture forming of a beautiful coincidence. An old man wandering past a concert hall and seeing a name he knew. He said, "Oh no, I've been to all of them." I said, "All of what?" He said, "Your concerts. In this area. I don't travel anymore, but anything within an hour or so." He said it the way you'd say you take a walk in the mornings. "I've been coming for years." I said, and I could hear how stupid it sounded even as it came out. "For how many years?" And he thought about it, actually thought, and said, "Since the first one at the Academy of Music? That would have been 2005, 2006? 20 years. For 20 years, Arthur Bell had been buying the cheapest ticket available. The ones up at the top, they're $11. It's the best deal in the city. And taking 2 buses and sitting in the last row of the balcony, and listening to me sing and going home, while I paid for the first row and left it empty. 20 years in the same buildings on the same nights, him at the very top, his seat at the very bottom empty, with his name on it in my head. 2 people keeping the same silence in the same room, one at each end, for 2 decades. I could not speak, which has, as you know, some history for me, and then I asked the only question there was, which was why. Why in God's name had he never come down? Never sent a note backstage? Never told me he was alive? And here's what he said. I have it exactly. I made him say it twice. He said, "Because you didn't need a teacher anymore. You needed to be a singer. If I'd come backstage, you'd have been a student again. Every time you saw me, you'd have been 11 years old in that room. I wasn't going to do that to you." He looked at his hands. "You spent 3 years being a girl who couldn't talk. I wasn't going to be one more person who kept you there." I said, but I wanted to thank you. I've wanted to thank you for 30 years. And Arthur Bell said, I know. I could see the chair. He knew about the seat, of course he knew. He read the profiles. He'd been in the building. He had sat in the top row of the Academy of Music and looked down at a permanently empty seat in the first row, and understood exactly what it was and who it was for. And he had chosen, concert after concert, year after year, not to take it, because taking it would have given me my thank you and taken away my career. And he judged the trade and made the call, alone, for 20 years. I asked him what changed. Why tonight? He said, well, and then he said, I'm 88, I've got something in the lungs. They've given me a number, and I don't much like it. And he shrugged, a small shrug, a man declining to make an event out of it. It seemed like it was time to take the seat. Didn't seem right to leave it empty forever. You'd have kept paying for it. I would have. I would have kept paying for that seat until I died. We talked for 2 hours. He told me things I did not know. He told me that in that first year when I was 10 and silent in the corner, he had gone to the principal and to my mother's psychologist and asked what he should do, and had been told to encourage me to speak, to draw me out, to set small goals. And he had listened politely and gone back to his room and decided to do the exact opposite of what 4 professionals had recommended. I asked him why. He said because everybody in that child's life was pulling. Somebody had to not pull. Somebody had to not pull. And I asked him about the metronome. 20 years I had wanted to know about the metronome, and it turns out it was the first thing he ever thought of. He said he had noticed I was watching the clock on the wall, that I stared at it, the whole time every day, and he thought, she's waiting for it to be over. She's waiting for all of it to be over. He said a clock tells you how much is left. That's no good to a child in that state. A metronome doesn't count down. It just keeps going. And then he said the sentence I will have on my wall until I die. I wanted her to have something in the room that kept time without keeping score. I have that metronome. He gave it to me on my last day of 8th grade, put it in my hands, said, you'll want this, and went back to the piano. It is on my dressing table before every performance of my life. It is on the table beside me right now. And for 30 years I have wound it and listened to it, and not known that it was not a gift. It was a piece of medical equipment designed and administered by a school music teacher who had correctly diagnosed something 4 specialists had missed. Near the end, when the ushers had finished, and the hall was almost dark, I asked him the question I had been circling for an hour, which was whether he understood what he had done, whether he knew he was the entire reason for all of it, the career, the voice, the fact that I could sit in that hall and speak to him at all. And he did the thing he always did, which was refuse the size of it. He said, I played the piano in an empty room, Elena. I didn't do anything. You did all of it. I just made sure the room stayed open. And I said, that's not nothing. That is the opposite of nothing. And Arthur Bell, 88, dying, in a stacked-up concert hall at 11 at night. Thought about that for a while, and then he said, well, maybe that's the job. Maybe that's the whole job, and nobody tells you. There is one more thing from that night in the stacked-up hall, and I have gone back and forth about whether to tell it, and I'm going to, because it is the piece that has actually changed how I live. Somewhere in the second hour I asked him what it had been like. Up there, 20 years in the $11 seats, watching a person you made, unable to say so. I expected, I think I wanted, some admission of how hard it had been. I wanted him to tell me he'd suffered a little, because that would have made us even. He considered it for a long time, and then he said, it was the best part of my life. Just that, no qualifier. And when I started to protest, when I started to say something about how unfair it was, how he should have had more, how he deserved to be thanked properly, he stopped me. He put his hand up about 4 inches off the armrest, which was all the emphasis he ever used for anything. He said, Elena, you've got it backwards. I wasn't up there suffering through it. I was up there enjoying it. He looked at the stage. Do you know what it is to sit in a room with 2,000 people and know something about the person on stage that not one of them knows? That's not deprivation. That's the best seat in the house. The best seat in the house was the $11 one at the top. He meant it completely. And then he said the thing I have not been able to stop thinking about for 3 weeks. People think the reward for helping somebody is being thanked. It isn't. The reward is getting to watch, and I got to watch for 20 years in a good suit, sitting down with the lights off. Nobody's had a better deal than me. The reward is getting to watch. I have spent my whole adult life believing I owed a debt so large it required a permanent monument in the first row of every hall I ever sang in. And the man I owed it to had been sitting 80 feet above that monument for 20 years, considering himself the luckiest man in the building. I do not think he was being modest. I have known him, in total, about 3.5 years of my life, and modesty is not what that was. I think he was reporting accurately. The way he reported that speaking to my mother was the harder one. I think Arthur Bell genuinely believed he came out ahead on the deal. And I think he is possibly the only person I have ever met who understood what giving actually is. There is a question I have been asked 4 times in 3 weeks, always by people who mean well, and I want to answer it here because the answer surprised me. The question is, aren't you angry? 20 years? He was in the building. He watched me pay for that seat and leave it empty. Hundreds of times knowing what it was. He let me believe he might be dead. He let me sit on a hotel floor in Munich. He could have sent one note, any year, any night, and spared me 2 decades of a grief that turned out to be unnecessary. And he chose not to, over and over, on purpose. Aren't you angry? I was for about 4 days. Around day 3, it got quite bad. I sat in my kitchen at 2 in the morning and had an entire argument with him out loud, and the argument went, "You don't get to decide that. You do not get to make a unilateral 20-year decision about my life without consulting me. That is not humility, that is control. You appointed yourself the judge of what I could handle and you never once asked, and I still think that is a fair charge." I want to say that clearly because I do not want to hand you a story where the quiet man is simply a saint. He made a call that was his to make only if you accept his premise, that seeing him would have turned me back into an 11-year-old, and that premise might have been wrong. It might be that I would have been fine. It might be that I would have had 20 years of Sundays instead of 3 weeks of them. That is a real loss, and I'm not going to pretend it away. But here's what ended the anger, and it happened on the 4th night. I was still arguing with him in my head, and I heard myself say, "You should have just asked me what I needed." And I stopped. Because that is precisely the thing every single adult in my childhood did. My mother, the psychologist, the speech therapist, my grandmother, every one of them asked me what I needed, constantly, with enormous love, and I could not answer, and every unanswerable question made the wall thicker. He was the only one who did not ask. He looked and assessed and acted, and took the entire weight of the decision onto himself, and never made me carry any part of it. That is what he did when I was 10. And it is the exact same thing he did for the next 20 years. It is not 2 behaviors. It is 1 behavior, sustained for 3 decades. And it is the reason I have a voice, and I do not get to praise it in 1994 and prosecute it in 2015. So no, I'm not angry. I have something better than anger, which is that I finally understand the shape of the man. And the shape is, he decides what will help you, and then he pays for it himself. And he does not send you the bill. 20 years in the $11 seats is the bill he did not send me. Here's where things stand, because I know you want to know and because it is not over. He is at home, with a caregiver 4 days a week, in the same house he has lived in since 1979, 22 minutes from my apartment. I have been there 6 times in 3 weeks. He has an upright piano in the front room that is badly out of tune, and he will not let me have it tuned. He says at this point they'd have to take it apart, and he doesn't want strangers in the house. I sing for him. That is what we do. I go over on Sunday afternoons and he sits in his chair and I stand by that terrible piano and I sing. And sometimes he plays and his hands are not what they were, and it does not matter at all. Last Sunday we did Du Bisti Rue, and he got about 6 bars in before his hand stopped, and he said the left hand's gone. And I said the left hand is just the floor. And he laughed. He actually laughed out loud, because I had quoted him to himself across 30 years. He never married. He has no children. He has a nephew in Arizona who calls on Sundays. 31 years of teaching, and I now know a great many children in that room over the years. I asked, and he was cagey, but I got out of him that there were a few others who needed the room. He would not tell me how many. He said it wasn't mine to know which is correct and which is exactly the answer a man like that gives. The doctors have given him a number. He was right that he doesn't much like it. I am not going to say it here, because it is his and not mine, and because numbers like that are wrong as often as they're right. I have canceled everything through the end of the season. My manager did not fight me. My manager, who fought me about a chair for 4 years, said go in about a second and a half. And the seat, people ask me about the seat. A journalist got hold of some version of this and asked whether I would stop reserving A1 now. No, it is still in my rider. It is still empty at every performance. Because here's the thing I understand now, that I did not understand 3 weeks ago, and it is the last thing I have to tell you. For 20 years I thought that empty seat was a debt I could not pay, a monument to a thank you that never got delivered. And it turns out that for those exact same 20 years, the man it belonged to was in the same building, at the top, in the $11 seats, listening, and had decided that the most loving available act was to stay up there and let me keep singing to an empty chair. We were never apart. That is what I have been trying to metabolize for 3 weeks. I thought I had lost him at 15 and spent my whole adult life singing into a void, and the void was occupied, every night. He was there for the debut, and the bad review, and the night I sang through my mother's funeral week, and every single ordinary Tuesday concert in between. Somebody was in the room the whole time, keeping time without keeping score. I want to tell you about last Sunday, because it is the most recent thing and because it is where all of this has landed. He was tired. Sundays vary now. The caregiver, a woman named Patrice, who is better at this than I will ever be, met me at the door and said it was a slow day, which is the word they use. He was in his chair, and I stood by the terrible out-of-tune piano and I asked him what he wanted, and he said, something long. Something long. I want you to understand what happened in me when he said that. 30 years ago, in a music room in Delaware County, a man played long pieces at a silent child on her worst days, because what she needed was not comfort, but proof that time would keep passing and the world would still be there in 25 minutes. He was asking me for the same thing. He was asking me to make the room last longer. So I sang for about 40 minutes without stopping. I did not ask him what he wanted next. I just kept going, one thing into the next, so that there were no gaps, so that the room simply continued. And he sat in his chair with his hands folded and his chin lifted, and at some point he closed his eyes. And I kept singing anyway, because the whole point is that you do not stop when they close their eyes. That is what he taught me. And I did not know I had learned it until I was standing in his front room doing it back to him. And when I finally stopped, he did not open his eyes right away. And then he did, and he said, the left hand was good. The left hand is where you stand. He is going to die soon. Not today. Probably not this month. But soon, and I have decided not to fight the way I fought with my mother, because fighting it took 11 months I could have spent otherwise. What I'm doing instead is Sundays. And here's the thing I have arrived at, 3 weeks in, which is the only useful thing I have to give you. I spent 20 years believing that the way to honor him was to hold a seat empty, to maintain a monument, to keep the wound open and well tended and paid for in every city I sang in. That is what I thought gratitude was. A permanent ache, carefully preserved. It is not. I know that now because I have spent 3 Sundays doing the actual thing. And the actual thing is, you find someone in a chair and you make the room last longer. The seat stays in my rider. But I understand what it is now, not a debt, not a monument. It is a reminder to go do the work on Sunday. It points at a chair in a front room 22 minutes from my apartment where an 88-year-old man is running out of time. And it says, he is still here, so go. And when he is not here anymore, that seat is going to point at somebody else. Because there is going to be a next one, a kid in a corner somewhere with a wall around her and a ring of good frightened people pushing on it, and somebody is going to have to not pull. I have already started asking around about the school. They cut the music program in 2009. I have some money. I have a name that opens doors in the city, and I have a brass metronome that a man put on the floor of an empty room 32 years ago because he noticed a child staring at a clock. I think you can probably see where this is going. I have not told him yet. I'm gonna tell him on Sunday. So if you're carrying a thank you, you cannot deliver. I have to tell you honestly that most of you will not get what I got. Most people don't get the lobby. I know exactly how rare it is. I had already grieved him. I had a false obituary and a hotel room floor in Munich to prove it. But I will tell you this, and I would stake the rest of my career on it. The people who saved us quietly are almost never doing it for the thanks. That is precisely why they were able to save us. Pulling was what everyone else was doing. The one who helped was the one who stopped pulling. And a person like that, who withholds their own presence for 20 years because your career mattered more to them than their credit, that person does not need your gratitude to be complete. They already have what they wanted. They are watching from the top row and they are satisfied. Keep the seat empty anyway. Not because the debt is unpaid, because the seat is how you say the true thing, which is not thank you, it's I'm still here. He gave me a voice by never once asking me to use it. And last night, 3 weeks ago now, I finally got to use it on him, in an empty hall. At 11 at night, with the chairs stacked around us. Somebody had to not pull. Be that person for someone. It costs you almost nothing. And it is, apparently, the whole job and nobody tells you. Drop one word in the comments that describes how this story made you feel. Just one word. Tell me where you're listening from. I read every comment. Share this with someone who once got you through the worst of it and never asked for anything back because they should hear it while they can. Hit subscribe and I will see you in the next one.